This is The Flower of Freedom by Deborah J. Reeves. All rights to both the book and the presentation are completely reserved. This is chapter 167, and we are continuing our virtuous cycle project. We hope that by sharing our story with you, this original story will give you some entertainment and some, perhaps 8 minutes of relaxation. And then perhaps you will have a little extra resource in your emotional cup so that you can share kindness with someone else somewhere in your world. We hope to sow into 1,000,000 ears and start 1,000,000 virtuous cycles to improve living conditions on this planet. Here we go, chapter 167, The Carnage. Dr. Gupta had seen this type of grief before. This man was asking for answers, and the doctor would give him everything within his power. The police are still trying to piece it all together. Until one of your children can tell them more, some of it is guesswork. I can tell you that Philippe suffered 2 devastating blows to his kidneys, and then 2 more powerful blows to his rib cage. Any one of those blows could have ended his life. The punches to the kidneys were from behind. They were not with a closed fist, but rather by rigidly pointed fingers delivered by someone strong. The blows to the chest ruptured his ribs. One penetrated his lower lung, causing a pneumothorax. That appears to have been the immediate cause of death. But consensus is that it is unlikely that anyone would have survived any of the blows. They appear to have been delivered by a trained killer. A trained killer? Oscar echoed, fearing that he knew precisely who that had to be. The doctor took control of directing Oscar, and he told them that a friend from Montreal had been visiting. He came when I asked him to lecture us on hand reconstruction. His name is Dr. Martineau. He's an expert in plastic surgery, but that's the specialty whose most expert surgeons are called upon to do hand reconstruction. The lecture was supposed to start on Monday, but another of our friends cajoled him into coming up early for Carnival. He has your daughter in surgery right now. I have no idea how long it will take, but I know that she's in the most superlative hands possible. Why don't you come with me and we'll see if the surgery has been completed? In a sort of fog, Oscar climbed the stairs behind Dr. Gupta, following him through the winding corridors until they came to a small waiting room outside a surgery. After the doctor spoke to the lady behind the sliding glass window, they had to wait only a few minutes until a burly man with a reddish beard walked up to meet them. Ah, Pierre, thank God you're here and willing to help. Thank goodness you got me surgical privileges last year, Pierre responded. Pierre, this is your patient's father, Monsieur Saint-Laurent. And then turning to Oscar, he said, this is Dr. Martineau. Thank you for what you did for Marie, Oscar said, rocking a little on his feet. Noticing his unsteadiness, Dr. Martineau suggested that they sit together on the seating provided for those who waited surgical news. Your daughter's doing very well. I have her heavily sedated right now because of the nightmare she's endured. It will also help with her pain levels. As to her fingers, I was glad that I was here to help. This sort of injury usually is crippling. It tears ligaments and shatters bones. I repaired and splinted the fingers, but they will have to remain immobile until they're healed. It was difficult to remove her engagement ring, but when it was loosened and removed, I slipped it onto her other hand, and a nurse wrapped it with surgical tape to ensure that it would not fall off. I've only seen this sort of intentional injury once before. I learned to be a doctor in the Canadian Armed Forces, and once, when we were stationed in a war zone, there was a Nazi who loved to do this as a form of torture. Hans Schmidt, the monster of Paris, Oscar muttered. What? Yes. How did you know? Asked Dr. Martineau in surprise. He got my best friend after he helped to liberate a chateau in the Loire Valley being used as a Nazi comfort station. We never recovered Desmond's body. Another of Hans' interests is incineration. The doctors looked at one another. A look passed between them that said, "What the hell are we dealing with?" Marie was conceived at that chateau. My wife was one of Hans' victims. Hans could be my son Bertie's biological father. At the end of the war, Hans escaped. When Bertie got those head injuries in Switzerland, the police suspect that Hans murdered 2 men in retaliation using very similar methods. He escaped after the war, and he escaped again in Switzerland. I cannot imagine how we could have tracked them here, Oscar said, with his head in his hands. Pierre, stay here with Monsieur Saint-Laurent. I'm going to get a policeman. They have no idea what they're facing. None of us is equipped to deal with this. This is a small town. I'll bring one back as quickly as possible, said Dr. Gupta as he turned to leave. By the time the doctor returned with the policeman, Dr. Martineau and Oscar were fast friends. Dr. Martineau knew both Dr. Donovan and Jean-Claude well. He even knew Sergeant Richard of the RCMP because he had once operated on his hand after a scuffle in which a suspect bit his hand down to the bone. When the local police officer started to question Oscar, Dr. Martineau stepped up to tell him what he knew of the monster of Paris. He referred the officer to Detective Sergeant Richard of the RCMP, who had more information about Hans Schmidt than either Oscar or he did. This man has suffered a terrible ordeal. Could we perhaps give him a few minutes to assure his wife that his daughter is okay, and then we will look in on his son who's still in a coma. We could meet you at the time you specify in the office near emergency, Dr. Gupta inquired. The police officer was a friendly sort who knew Dr. Gupta from his many visits to the ER with drunken revelers and accident victims. He almost seemed relieved at the suggestion and quickly agreed to the plan. Thanks, Doc, he said to Dr. Gupta. I'll meet you all there in about an hour. Is that enough time? I can try to get a hold of Detective Sergeant Richard in the interim. That's the end of chapter 167. We pray that you'll come back for chapter 168, and that's called Revelations. Please, if you're inclined, plant your seed to the virtuous cycle today. And don't forget to water other seeds that you've planted or that you see that others have planted. Please and thank you. I remain Deborah.